The fight between the White House and Congress grows bitter. The hostilities between Israel and Gaza grow deadlier. And a top U.S. spy is kicked out of Germany. We explore the chasms and the possibilities for compromise on all three fronts tonight on Washington Week.
Not in Marietta. Not in Marietta.
No papers, no fear. Our kids are staying here.
The immigration debate takes a fierce new turn as House Republicans prepare to sue the president.
Listen, this is a problem of the president's own making. He's been president for 5.5 years. When's he going to take responsibility for something?
You hear some of them. They're like, sue him, impeach him. Really? For what? You're going to sue me for doing my job?
Tough talk from all sides, but is there any room left for compromise? The same question looms along Israel's border with Gaza as rockets and bombs fly.
No country on earth would remain passive in the face of hundreds of rockets fired on its cities, and Israel is no exception.
We call on the Security Council to act now to stop the bleeding in occupied Palestine.
Can the U.S. broker a ceasefire? And nations spying on their allies. Will old friends become new enemies? Covering the week, Ed O'Keefe of The Washington Post, Fawn Johnson of National Journal, Indira Lakshmanan of Bloomberg News, and Mark Mazetti of The New York Times.
Award-winning reporting and analysis, covering history as it happens. Live from our nation's capital, this is Washington Week with Gwen Ifill. Once again, live from Washington, moderator Gwen Ifill.
Good evening. On the surface this week, the fight was about immigration, whether unaccompanied minors should be allowed to cross the border illegally and then be allowed to stay until they work their way through the legal process. I spoke to White House Domestic Policy Advisor Cecilia Munoz on the NewsHour.
We're approaching this as a urgent humanitarian situation, but it's also true that we have to make it clear to any parent who might be making the decision to put their child in the hands of traffickers and smugglers that this is an incredibly dangerous thing to do, and they should not do it based on the false premise that they're guaranteed status in the United States, because that's simply not true.
The dispute quickly morphed into another version of the increasingly bitter recurring standoff between the president and congressional Republicans.
Amnesty is unfolding before our very eyes, and I would suggest the only response that will stop this humanitarian disaster is for President Obama to start enforcing the law, to stop promising amnesty, to stop refusing to enforce federal immigration law, and finally to secure the border.
No one thinks the other side has their priorities right, and the bitterness quickly spread to discussion of old frictions, including the president's use of executive action. But first, let's talk about the problem at hand, the tens of thousands of unaccompanied minors from Central American countries surging across the border. Before we get to the dispute, let's explain the law, though. Fawn.
The law. Well, I think we need to be clear about what law we're talking about. Actually, I think this is the place where you're starting to see some confusion in Congress. The law that's actually causing all of the stopgaps and the bottlenecks at the border is an anti-trafficking, human trafficking law that was passed in 2008, signed into law by President Bush, and passed on unanimous consent, all sides agreeing in the House and the Senate. It did two things that have changed things at the border. The first thing that it did was it gave the Department of Health and Human Services full custody of children who are identified as not being with a parent or other guardian when they cross the border, who are essentially alien minors. And the other thing that it did is it required HHS to look for a parent or a guardian inside the country to put these children with. So the idea was, prior to the 2008 law, they were essentially trying to evaluate whether or not the child was an asylum candidate who should be put in foster care, and a bunch of advocates and a number of people who were involved in these cases said it would be much better if they were with their families. It takes some time to do that. There's been a massive influx of It's been growing, escalating. You know, in a couple years ago it was 10,000. Last year it was 20,000, and now we're up to 40,000 already in this fiscal year of children who come from Central America.
And this was originally considered to be an anti-trafficking law.
Right.
This was supposed to find some way to help children who were being victimized by smugglers.
The whole point is that if you are a child, you are entitled to special rights under the law. Right. That if you are here in an undocumented status and you are a child, you can't be prosecuted like you would be if you're an adult. And the reason why the law has been in place for 20 years, it's been updated to try and reflect that that all these children, they need some kind of help. There are calls to give them legal representation, which they don't have now.
So now we have a crisis on hand. So here's what was the president's short-term stopgap solution: $3.7 billion to find some way to fix this problem, to stop the surge of children across the border, or is that what it would do?
It would do a lot of things. You got nearly $2 billion would go to Health and Human Services to help shelter and care for these immigrants. Another $1.6 billion would go to the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice for enforcement, to move Border Patrol down there to help with the influx and to help begin processing as quickly as possible. Another $300 million, interestingly, would go to the State Department to help Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, which are known as the Northern Triangle of Central America, or the Triángulo Norte, as they talk about it down there. Help those countries repatriate these people, and also start an advertising campaign that says, don't come, it's unsafe and it's illegal. That was dismissed today by the top appropriator in the House as too much money. They said that they will go...
Too much money or spent the wrong way?
Too much money and potentially spent the wrong way. They're reviewing what exactly should be done. House Republicans are, at least. They're going to put forth some policy proposals and potential solutions next week. Once those are in place, the bean counters will sit there and try to figure out how much money there's here. The other problem is Republicans, at least, are arguing that some of this isn't necessarily emergency funding, that it's actually being done through the normal spending process, and so probably could be worked out that way.
Ed, backing up for a second, so the immigration problem is one that has existed for a long time. There have been children who have been trying to get over the border for a long time. What is creating this present crisis, and specifically in those countries you mentioned?
Sure. I talked to the Guatemalan ambassador about 2 weeks ago, and I kind of asked him, are we characterizing this correctly? And he said, well, look, you've got basically three distinct problems down there. You have incredible gang violence in El Salvador. If you live here in the Washington area, for example, there are gangs that are tied to Salvadoran gangs, and the violence there is such that these kids are just fleeing it because they're either being recruited into these gangs or they're trying to get away from them. In Honduras, one of the bigger problems is the drug cartels. And you go to San Pedro Sula, it's now the most dangerous city in the world, and that's in Honduras. In Guatemala, it's a mix of those two things, plus extreme poverty and illiteracy. And that's a problem in all three countries. There's just despair, hopelessness. And so they see, or they might hear through the radio, in the newspaper, on TV, that the United States is tinkering with its immigration laws. They might hear from somebody who's here that says, hey, I hear that they're starting to let the kids, stay legally, so they make a run for the border.
But, Fawn, the political pushback is that these folks are manipulating a loophole in our system in order to take advantage, frankly, to use these children as a shield to allow either their parents to come and stay, to do something to basically find another way across the border.
And the real problem here is that there's actually disparity in the 2008 law. It was not written to be like this, but back when they wrote it, a lot of the kids that they were apprehending at the border were from Mexico. Almost all of them were, and the law specifically required the Secretary of State to work with the Mexican government to figure out how to send these children back. So they actually we have an agreement in the United States with Mexico, with the child authorities there, and about 11,000 kids have crossed the border from Mexico of Mexican descent that are almost immediately turned back around and turned to the child authorities there. The problem is that we don't have those agreements with those other three countries, the triangle, and the law does not actually even require that we should do that. So it's almost like, it kind of is a loophole, even though no one wants to call it that, and no one intended it to be that.
But as the information comes out about the DREAM Act, and people hear about that, and they think, oh, okay, well, there's going to be an amnesty for young people who are here, and they're going to get to go to school and everything. How can you blame them from trying to escape the life on the streets and the gang violence and everything, particularly if their parents, some of them are already over here, and they're living, almost as orphans in their home countries.
And that's where you hear the Republicans say he should enforce the laws that are on the books and not go do this executive action thing, because that's what prompts people to send their kids. I talked to Luis Gutierrez this week, who we talk to all the time about immigration. He said, I met with some kids recently up in Chicago at my office who came only recently under the impression that that policy was going to apply to them. And I had to tell them, no, you didn't get here in time. You're too late. You're going to have to go home or find another way to stay here.
Tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it seems like everybody's between a rock and a hard place on this, politically and in policy. The president, if he tries to change the law, there are people on the Hill who will say, we don't care what you suggest, we are not going to give you anything you need. The money to sustain a failed policy, I think someone put it. Right. If you're Republicans, however, and you have been hoping that the immigration issue would kind of go away because it doesn't cut for you, they're also between, we saw it with Rick Perry this week, between a rock and a hard place about whether to get on board with some solution or to resist. How is that shaking out?
Well, the thing that I was most interested in was on the day that the president's request dropped on Capitol Hill. I was talking to a bunch of Republicans in the Senate and in the House, and in the House Republicans have a terrible relationship with Barack Obama. I don't need to tell you that, but they were literally rolling their eyes at me. They just couldn't believe that it was so much. They had thought it was going to be $2 billion. It was $3.7 billion. They thought he didn't know what he was doing, and none of them had actually really seen it. I mean, I hadn't really seen it all that much, but I think that what the administration is banking on is that the Republicans in the House can't just reject it out of hand, because it looks like then they're ignoring a crisis.
And let me leave you with a glimmer of hope. In talking to Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham, who were the leading Republican members of that Gang of Eight that we talked about last summer,
in favor of
as the immigration bill was passed, they said, look, this crisis might potentially be our opening to really try to tackle this. Because if we fix border security, which is the Republican request, and we use this as a way to do that, perhaps then we can start talking about all those other things we want to get done.
One quick question. Why did President Obama, when he was in Texas, he was there on a fundraising trip, why did he not go down to the border and be seen with those children? We've got a humanitarian crisis. Why not do it?
Well, logistically, the White House planned these fundraisers weeks ago, so making a move to the border was potentially a big logistical nightmare. And you did have some Democrats in Texas saying, keep those law enforcement dealing with the situation, don't have him come. He dismissed it as a potential photo op in a week that he was having several photo ops. There is a belief, and there's a hope certainly on Capitol Hill, that he will go at some point to see it.
Or that the optics would have looked bad for him in that photo op.
Potentially.
Yeah. The other thing that I have considered in thinking about whether he should go down there, because I do think he should, is that if he goes and starts treating it like a big refugee crisis, that in turn could totally turn around the message that he's trying to send, which is, don't come, we can't take care of you.
And it also makes a lot of immigration advocates unhappy, because they're not crazy about the enforcement part of this anyhow, so he's making a lot of his supporters
unhappy. Think of the images are seen in Central America that, he's now literally taking care of them. I mean, that might just cause more of a flow.
Yeah, it could backfire. Boomerang. Okay, well, we're not done with that story yet, but we're going to move on. Because in the Middle East, disputes usually move immediately past mere rhetoric. 3 Israeli teenagers were found murdered. Airstrikes in Gaza ensued, as well as the retaliatory killing of a Palestinian teenager. By tonight, the fight was a welter of air raids, rockets, interceptors, and something called the Iron Dome. So what is the intent on both sides right now, tonight?
Right. Well, the crisis at this point is really at a boiling stage. We've seen more than 100 deaths on the Palestinian side. Many of them are reported to be children, women, elderly people, so a lot of civilians in this. We also see that Hamas from the Gaza Strip is saying, we're not backing down. In fact, we're going to continue rocketing. We're going to rocket Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, which is really taking it up to the next level, not just hitting into the areas in southern Israel where they had been aiming targeting and targeting before, but hitting major cities. Now, Iron Dome that you mentioned, this is, a U.S.-funded missile defense program, effectively, which has been the reason that you have not seen Israeli casualties yet. You have not seen Israelis dead because of the protection they have from the rockets through Iron Dome.
But there have been a lot of Palestinian casualties.
There have been a lot, as I said, more than 100 Palestinian casualties, more than 1,000 Palestinians who are now homeless because of this. And, the Israelis, of course, it goes back down to the same argument we've seen 100 times. The Israelis say, well, the Palestinians started it because Hamas is rocketing us and firing missiles at us, and nobody would stand for being rocketed in their homeland, and we have to defend ourselves. And the Palestinians, of course, say, well, let me say, I don't want to equate the Palestinians with Hamas. No. This is Hamas who is doing this, and the Palestinian Authority and the moderate Palestinians, I would say mainstream Palestinians, don't seem to be supporting this. And certainly the government of Mahmoud Abbas is not supporting this. But Hamas and their followers...
It's not a government, so how do you negotiate?
Well, yeah, okay, that's a really good point. How do you negotiate? I mean, I thought it was very interesting. The White House yesterday read out a call that President Obama had with Bibi Netanyahu of Israel. And one of the lines in there, you would have needed to have a semantics expert to really parse the line. And what they said was something along the lines of, the United States stands ready to facilitate the cessation of hostilities, okay? Everyone jumped all over it. There was a huge Twitter sphere, storm about this. And people were saying, my goodness, is President Obama recognizing Hamas? Is he saying he's going to talk to Hamas? And, the White House had to come back and say, no, we didn't say mediate. We said facilitate. And we didn't say, that we were going to get in there and make a ceasefire happen, but we're ready to do what we can to try to help. I mean, I think the larger question, though, is what can the U.S. do to help the situation?
The U.S. has been trying to facilitate for decades the end of various hostilities in this, right? And more recently, John Kerry has done the shuttle diplomacy to try to broker some kind of long-term peace deal. It seemed like the White House really wasn't all that enthusiastic, right? And so where is the White House now? I mean, do they think that this is just hopeless and they will keep fighting, and only after the fighting stops can there be any hope for some kind of deal?
Look, I think there's a lot of distress in Washington about what is going on over there. At the same time, though, remember, we're seeing a return to what we saw last 2 years ago. It was 2012 when we had a similar 8-day war between Hamas and the Israelis. And, I heard a term from the Israelis that is used, which is called mowing the grass. And it sounds disturbing, but you hear Israeli officials say, well, every once in a while, maybe it's every 2 years, we need to go in there and get rid of all those rockets. And remember that Hamas has a lot of underground tunnels in Gaza, right underneath civilian areas, in which they've got rocket workshops, they've got storage areas. And one of the game changers this time is that they now have larger range rockets that they didn't have before, that are supposedly Syrian-made, Iranian-supplied, and the Israelis want to take that out. So I think there's a lot of agita in the White House about this. At the same time, I'm not sure that they know what they can do as their influence has declined because the U.S. brokered peace process fell apart just a couple months ago.
So let's play out what might happen over the weekend. If they start hitting Tel Aviv, the airport, other parts of the city, or even further into Israel, are we looking at a ground war?
I think that if anyone in Israel is killed, then I think we are looking at definitely at ramping up. President Shimon Peres has already said, prepare for a ground war. We may need to do this. They have called up the possibility of tens of thousands of reservists, although I think only about 1,500 of them have actually been called to duty. I'm not sure that Israel really wants to take that step of going to a ground war, because they would, of course, be exposing themselves to serious casualties. And I'm not sure that they want to go into Gaza and reoccupy. But they maybe want to put an exclamation point on this to say, we can do it if we want to, and we're going to try to knock out your storage facilities. I mean, another sort of Machiavellian question, conspiracy theorist you might say, is that maybe there are those in the military wing of Hamas who wanted this to happen, who, used the revenge attack on the Palestinian youth as an excuse for doing this, because actually they maybe want to get out of this unity government with the Palestinian Authority, because, they're under pressure from Islamic Jihad and other extremist factions to not have a unity government.
Okay. Okay, we just have to move on. We have one more segment to get to. Finally tonight, Angela Merkel is not the happiest leader in the world right now. The problem is that even after the U.S. and Germany seemed to get past last year's disclosure that the National Security Agency had been listening in on her phone calls, there's now fresh evidence that 2 more Americans, at least, have been spying on her government. The White House says they're working things out behind the scenes.
Any differences that we have are most effectively resolved through established private channels, not through the media.
But Merkel complained publicly and expelled the CIA station chief in Brazil, so diplomatic relationships between 2 old friends are frayed again. How serious is this, Mark?
Well, it's serious when you kick the CIA station chief out of a country, and when it's Germany, it's really serious. It's a very good relationship. Historically, it's been a very good intelligence sharing relationship. The Germans don't do it lightly. And as we heard today, they did it very publicly. And I think they wanted to embarrass the Obama administration, because I think in part they felt that the Obama administration didn't really appreciate how angry and in a way hurt they are about this whole escalation of spying operations.
Except the argument is all friends spy on each other, all nations do this, and that she's just being a baby about it.
Yes, that is the argument you hear. I think most countries do indeed spy on each other. I think, though, the Germans take not only offense because it's them, I think they feel this is very personal. That the cell phone issue became a big deal for Merkel. Right. It's also a political issue. She has to sort of stand up to the idea that she can just get pushed around by the White House. It's also this idea that okay, last year happened, the Snowden revelations happened. You guys should have learned your lesson. This should not happen. What happened last week with the German intelligence officer arrested, and so something needed to be done, and so they made this move earlier in the week in kicking the station chief out. And we'll see what happens. It was in a way symbolic, but it does show the level of anger.
Well, and Mark, what would we want to learn anyway from Germany? I mean, why is this such a big deal in the sense that we would assume that is it worse that they got caught or that the spying was happening?
Isn't that always the question?
Always. Right. Always. So, German officials say that they share 80 to 90% of intelligence with the United States, and the United States might say, well, we're interested in the other 20 to 10%. But more seriously, all countries have their own interests, and most countries, with the exception of a small group of countries, the United States has a sort of quasi-agreement with Britain, Canada, other English-speaking countries. The feeling is that those countries are not in line with the United States, so you need to check out what their leaders might be saying to other leaders. There might be, terrorist plots going on inside countries that the other country might not want to notify the United States about. So there is an argument for spying. However, there is a very good question about when it comes to an ally. They've clearly shown that they're angry about this. If you're going to do it, you better make sure that the benefits of it really outweigh the costs. And as we've seen today, the costs are high.
And let me ask you, because Angela Merkel came off in this as sort of everyone's sensible aunt. I thought she kind of, clucked her tongue and said yesterday, common sense tells you it's not worth it to waste your time.
Better things to do with your time.
To spy on allies. And she said repeatedly, if you want to know something, President Obama, just call me up. You know my number. Call me up and I'll tell you. We know that he knows that.
Because that's the way it works. You just call them up and they tell you.
And you heard her finance minister saying this is so stupid, it makes you want to cry.
Yeah, I think some of the details that have come out so far make it seem like it's a very kind of low-level operation that was not worth getting, fraying this relationship. There's a lot more to come out, but it's also particularly embarrassing where this German spy that the United States tried to recruit then may have, in the words of someone in the news today, tried to take his talents to the Russians.
I knew you were going to get a LeBron reference.
Yeah, of course. So that then really blows up in the face of the United States. And that's what's another very embarrassing episode.
We're really out of time. I'm sorry, Ed. I know you had another question, but you know that's what our webcast is for. We'll get back to this because before we leave tonight, I need to send out condolences to the family of a great man, John Siegenthaler. John was a tremendous journalist. He was a fierce defender of the First Amendment, and he was a courtly son of Tennessee who championed civil rights long before most Southern newspaper editors would. He was also a terrific storyteller, a voracious reader, and just fun to be around. He and his wife Dolores were married as long as I've been alive. Our thoughts are with her and the rest of the Siegenthaler family tonight. John Siegenthaler, the former editor of the Nashville Tennessean, was 86 years old. I'll miss him, and if you knew him, you would too. Thanks, everyone. We have to go for now, but as always, the conversation will continue online. The Washington Week webcast extra streams live at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. Plus, you can find it all week long at pbs.org/Washington Week. Among other things, we'll be talking about a new gun control effort on Capitol Hill. Keep up with daily developments with me and Judy Woodruff on the PBS NewsHour, and we'll see you here next week on Washington Week. Good night.